we're going to be continuing sort of our look at the major prophets. And so tonight we're going to be in the book of Lamentations. And I imagine that there are some of you here who probably remember in vivid detail what it was like when you found out that JFK had died. And I know I don't remember that, of course, but I remember in great detail 9/11, and I remember exactly where I was and what I was doing. And I was only in 6th grade that year, but I remember I was wearing a green windsuit. It was green and purple windsuit, and we were in gym class, and the coach was listening to the radio when suddenly the announcer on the radio starts freaking out and talking about what was happening. And I remember a lot of the things that happened on that day, as I'm sure that many of you do as well. And I've read some about the Civil War, and the Civil War was just a terrible time, and it was difficult. That you read about people who talk about Americans killing Americans and destroying the cities, and how difficult it was for people to cope with that. And so, if you can kind of put yourself in those moments again, in that mindset, then you can understand to a degree how Jeremiah feels as he writes the book of Lamentations. And Jeremiah is writing not only his personal grief, but he is writing about the national grief that King Nebuchadnezzar of the Babylons had come into Jerusalem decades before and had taken captives. At first he came and he took Daniel and others with him, and then he came in later and he took more captives. He took Ezekiel and others with him. But this final time, the king comes in, and he doesn't just take captives, although he does that. He takes almost everybody, but he just completely destroys the city. And there's almost nothing left there. He tears down the temple and the palaces of David. And so he feels, in the book of Lamentations, he writes about their national grief and the feeling that all hope is lost. And yet, even amidst all of that darkness, he has but there is hope if we can look for it. And so that's when we start in chapter 1. And there are 5 chapters in the book of Lamentations, and each chapter follows the same pattern. Each chapter is its own poem. And Hebrew poems are a little different than ours. They're less concerned about rhyming and things like that. And the way that this poem works is every verse is started with a different letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And so there's 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet, and you'll notice each of the chapters has 22 verses. And each of those verses then, and so verse 1 would start with their letter A, and verse 2 would start with their letter B, which is actually more like a G, and so forth and so on. That's the poem this was a common sort of poem that Hebrew people wrote. You can find it in Psalm 119 about the law of the Lord and all of those things. That you can find it in Proverbs chapter 30, starting in verse 10, when it talks about the virtuous wife. That follows that same pattern, A, B, C, D. But he does it here in the book of Lamentations, and I heard it said this way one time, and I really liked it. It said he is weeping from A to Z, that he is just completely devastated by this. And so that's how he expresses his deep grief, is he weeps from A to Z with each of these 5 poems that follow that same pattern. And so he starts, and in the first poem, the first chapter, he says, everything feels hopeless, and he feels like it's all our fault. And that's what the first chapter talks about. And it starts in verses 1, and it says, how lonely sits the city that was full of people. How like a widow is she who is great among the nations. The princes among the provinces has become a slave. She weeps bitterly in the night, and her tears are on her cheeks. Among all her lovers, she has none to comfort her. All her friends have dealt treacherously with her. They have become her enemies. And so he's talking, of course, about a city, but he describes as if she is a widow, and describes this devastation, that there is no one who cares that she is suffering. There is no one who cares what she is going through. And he reflects on this, and he says in verses 8 and 9, he says, I feel like this is all our fault. He says in verse 8, Jerusalem has sinned gravely. Therefore she has become vile. All who honored her despise her, because they have seen her nakedness. Yes, she sighs and turns away. Her uncleanness is in her skirt. She did not consider her destiny. Therefore her collapse was awesome. She had no comforter, O Lord, behold, my affliction for the enemy is exalted. And so he says there, he says, we did this to ourselves. And in this instance, he was right about that. He continues in verse 18, and he reflects, he says, the Lord is righteous, for I rebelled against his commandment. Now remember, he's not writing about himself only. He's writing as if he is the city of Jerusalem, as if he is the country of Israel. And so he is saying that I, the country, I, the city, have rebelled against God's commandment. He says God is right. God knew what was best. God knows what to do. He is righteous. It's us that rebelled against his commandment. He says in verse 18, hear now all peoples, and behold my sorrow. My virgins and my young men have gone into captivity. That there's nobody left in this city. There's hardly anyone there. And so he says, this is what we did to ourselves. And he says that ultimately, it was their desire to sin that caused them to put their trust in the wrong places. Verse 19, he says, I called for my lovers, but they deceived me. My priests and my elders breathed their last in this city while they sought food to restore their life. And that lovers is a way he's describing the idols that they worshipped. And he's saying, we put our trust there, but there wasn't any really hope there. And so what was left was this devastation, these people who were hungry, but they couldn't find any food. And so he guides the nation to look back toward God. And he says in verse 20, he says, see, O Lord, that I am in distress, that my soul is troubled, that my heart is overturned within me. For I have been very rebellious. Outside the sword bereaves, and at home it is like death. And so even amidst all of this hopelessness, he says, turn back, look, let God see how much we are suffering here and that we need him. And that's really, as he gets into chapter 2 and that second poem, and again, it follows that same pattern, 22 verses. That second poem, he's going to emphasize here that God's wrath exposed what was really already there. That God's wrath just exposed their shame. The idea that sometimes people kind of feel like, well, if nobody knows about this, if nobody is aware of what I'm doing, then there's really no harm. There's really no shame. And the point that he'll make in chapter 2 is that all that God's wrath did was just show what was already underneath there. It just revealed who they really were. And so he starts in the verse 9 verses and he says, it is God that brought this destruction upon Jerusalem. He says in verse 1, how the Lord has covered the daughter of Zion with a cloud in his anger. He cast down from heaven to the earth the beauty of Israel. He did not remember his footstool in the day of his anger. He says, it's God that has done this to them. Verse 3, he has cut off in fierce anger every horn of Israel. He has drawn back his right hand from before the enemy. He has blazed against Jacob like a flaming fire, devouring all around. It was in verse 5, the Lord who was like an enemy. He swallowed up Israel. He swallowed up all of her palaces. He destroyed her strongholds. He increased mourning and lamentation in the daughter of Judah. It was God in verse 6 who had done violence to his tabernacle, the temple of God himself, as if it were a garden, he says. He destroyed his place of assembly, and the Lord has caused the appointed feast and the Sabbaths to be forgotten in Zion. In his burning indignation, he has spurned the king and the priest. It was the Lord, verse 7, that spurned his own altar, that abandoned his own sanctuary. He has given up the walls of her palaces into the hand of the enemy. They have made a noise in the house of the Lord, as on a day of the set feast. He says, this is what God chose to do. And he says, now our outside matches our inside. And that's verse 10. He says, the elders of the daughters of Zion sit on the ground and they keep silence. They throw dust on their heads. They gird themselves with sackcloth. The virgins of Jerusalem bow their heads to the ground. And he says, my eyes fall with tears. My heart is troubled. My bile is poured out on the ground because of the destruction of the daughter of my people. He says, in essence, it's really kind of the same thing that Jesus describes in Matthew chapter 23. In Matthew chapter 23, when he's talking to the scribes and the Pharisees, and he says, Matthew chapter 23, and starting in verse 27, he's describing their hypocrisy. And he says, woe to you, this is verse 27, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, for you are like whitewashed tombs, which indeed appear beautiful outwardly, but inside are full of dead men's bones and all uncleanness. Even so, you are also outwardly appear righteous to men, but inside you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. And that's what Lamentations 2 is describing. It says you see a beautiful tomb that's whitewashed, and it's something that's beautiful to behold, but no one wants to go inside where the dead bones are. No one wants to see what's on the inside of that. That was the scribes and Pharisees of Jesus' day, and incidentally, it wasn't so many decades after this that, again, Jerusalem was completely destroyed, that the temple was completely pulled down. When the people of a society come to the place where they live in sin, and they act like that's just a normal thing to do, and that there's nothing wrong with that, that is when society comes closer and closer to what happened to Jerusalem in both of these instances. And so that's what he describes in Lamentation 2. He says, after the destruction came, all that shame that they were hiding, and they dressed beautifully and act like everything was fine, now they're wearing the sackcloth. Now they put the ashes on their head. Now their outside matches the shame that they were carrying on the inside. And he says, everybody can see that. Verse 13, how shall I console you? To what shall I liken you, O daughter of Jerusalem? What shall I compare with you that I may comfort you, O virgin daughter of Zion? For your ruin is spread as wide as the sea. Who could heal you? Everybody knows about their shame now because they didn't do something about it before all of this. And so Jeremiah tries to guide the nation to humility. And that's what verse 18 shows us. In verse 18 it says, their heart cried out to the Lord. O wall of the daughter of Zion, let tears run down like a river day and night. Give yourself no relief. Give your eyes no rest. Arise, cry out in the night at the beginning of the watches. Pour out your heart like water before the Lord. Lift your hands toward him. And that's when the Bible describes lifting up hands. It's the idea that you are expressing, there's nothing in my hands. There's nothing that I have that I could do. Nothing that I could save myself with. I'm lifting empty hands to you so that you can grab on and pull me out of this, so that you can save me from this. And so he says, pour out your heart like water before the Lord. Humble yourself before the Lord so that maybe something better can come out of all of this. And so he feels hopeless. And he's ready to accept that they had done this to themselves. He's ready to say what God had said all along and we hid. Now it is out in the open. Humility is the only way up. As James 4:10 describes, if we humble ourselves in the sight of the Lord, then he will lift us up. But then we get to chapter 3, and this is the third poem. If you notice, this one is a little bit longer. It has 66 verses, and so that's, you think, 22 times 3 is 66, and so it's every 3 verses is one letter. And so A is going to be verses 1 through 3, and B is going to be verses 4 through 6, so forth and so on. But it follows that same pattern, but this is the longest of the chapters because it really gets to the point of what Jeremiah wants to talk about. And it is my favorite of the chapters in the book of Lamentations. And this is the idea. It feels like God is against us, but remember his compassion. Remember God's compassion. He starts in the verse 18 verses, and he describes how it feels like God is against them. In verse 1, and really, he begins to talk about himself. And even before Jerusalem was destroyed, I think Jeremiah felt like this often because Jeremiah's ministry was a very difficult ministry. There are very few people who ever really listened to what Jeremiah had to say. And he started at a young age, and he prophesied for decades and had very little success in convincing people. And the book of Jeremiah tells us not because he didn't do a good job, he just did what God told him, but because of how hard-hearted the people were of his time. And so he says in verse 1, he says, I am the man who has seen affliction by the rod of his wrath. He has led me and made me walk in darkness and not in light. Surely he has turned his hand against me time and time again throughout the day. This is what he feels about God right now. Verse 16, he says, he's broken my teeth with gravel. He's covered me with ashes. You have moved my soul far from peace. I have forgotten prosperity. And I said, my strength and my hope have perished from the Lord. He is in a really dark place. And he is saying, it feels as though I have nothing to hope in. It feels as though I have nothing to grab onto that's going to get me out of this. But then as he gets into verse 8 and 19, he has sort of a transition. And he says, remember my affliction and my roaming, the wormwood and the gall, my soul still remembers and sinks within me. And that's the word sinks there. It's really the idea of to bow down. And so what he's saying is, he's saying, as I think about it, I can remember I have been through difficult times before. I have been in dark places before. And if I will bow down my soul before the Lord, he says, in verse 21, I recall to my mind, therefore I have hope. That in the darkest of places, and I feel like our congregation has really hit some bumps lately. There's been some very difficult and dark things that many of us have been dealing with. And I'm not saying necessarily that it's like Jerusalem and that it's because of sin or anything like that, but just that we have had some very difficult months in the past few months. And sometimes in those darkest of days, it can sort of feel like Jeremiah says, it can feel like it's just never going to stop. The waves are just going to keep crashing over you, that we're never going to get any relief from this, and people can begin to feel hopeless. But he says, think about it. Think about your past, your own past. You've been through hard things before, and hasn't he always gotten you through it? Think about the people in Scripture like Jeremiah, like Joseph or Isaiah, like Jesus himself or Daniel, and look at all the hard things that they went through, but it shows us over and over and over again, when we really remember that history, God got them through those things every time. God was always there for them. And so he says, I think about it, and I have hope. In verse 22, he says, through the Lord's mercies we are not consumed. This will sound familiar, because we have a song that we sing that comes right from here. He says, his compassions fail not. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore, I hope in him. In other words, what he's saying is, if I have God, I love this verse right here, because we do have that song that we sing. And the song that we sing, it is just sunlight, isn't it? It's just a positive song about how God does take care of us, about how he is there for us, that we can trust his faithfulness. And that song that is pure sunlight comes from one of the darkest books in the Old Testament, from one of the most, it's called Lamentations, it's called Weeping. And that we could have a song that comes from a book like that gives us such strength and hope, shows the depth of Jeremiah's faith, and that he is saying here, he says, when I really think about it, his compassion never fails. Every morning, we can wake up and find something that God has blessed us with. We can wake up and find something to hold on to. He says, great is your faithfulness. God is dependable. We can trust him. And the Lord is my portion. It's especially that line that really gets me. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. When you see portion is the idea of what you possess. It's what belongs to you. It's the double portion that was given to the oldest son. It's your inheritance. It's what belongs to you. And Jeremiah, he doesn't have a portion anymore. Everything is gone. His friends, if he had hardly any, they were taken off into captivity. It's possible that his own home was knocked over or burned down in this destruction. The temple where he worshipped God, it's gone. Jeremiah doesn't have anything but the clothes on his back. But he says, God is my portion. If I have God, I could have literally nothing else in this world, but if I have God, my soul says, I have everything I need, because he is faithful. And so he says, therefore, I will hope in him. If I have God, I have everything I need, and I can wait on his compassion. That's what he continues in verse 25. He says, the Lord is good to those who wait for him, to the soul who seeks him. It is good that one should hope and wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. It is good for a man to bear the yoke in his youth. Let him sit alone and keep silent, because God has laid it on him. Let him put his mouth in the dust, that there may yet be hope. Let him give his cheek to the one who strikes him and be full of reproach. He says, it is a burden sometimes. Sometimes things are laid on us, and we don't even know why they're there. But as we've talked a little bit recently about perseverance from the book of Genesis, that's what he's talking about here too. He says, we can we can wait. He says sometimes it's waiting quietly. Sometimes it's just waiting it out, but we can wait and know that God's compassion is coming. God always provides and takes care of us. And he says, if there is sin to deal with, then let's deal with that. Verse 40, he says, let us search out and examine our ways. Let us turn back to the Lord. Let us lift our hearts and our hands to God in heaven. We have transgressed and rebelled, and you have not pardoned yet. And so he says we can bring that to God, and he will see our patient humility. He says in verse 49, my eyes flow and do not cease without interruption, till the Lord from heaven looks down and sees. My eyes bring suffering to my soul because of the daughters of my city. But he continues in verse 55, and he says, I call on your name, O Lord, from the lowest pit. You have heard my voice. Do not hide your ear from my sighing or my cry from help. You draw near on the day I called you and said, do not fear. It says, if we humble ourselves and cry out to God, God always answers. God doesn't want us to have this fear. He wants to help us through these things. He will hear us. The fourth poem then, chapter 4, again, it's just 22 verses. When he says, when it feels like all hope is lost, remember God's justice, that God works these things out. And he does describe a hopeless situation. Verse 1, he's talking about the temple, and he says that the gold has become dim, and the stones of the sanctuary are scattered. And it's very similar to what Jesus said about the second time they destroyed the temple. He said they would rip down every stone, and not one of them would be laid on top of the other. The same thing he describes here. He says it's completely torn down. He says in verse 6, he says, the punishment of the iniquity of the daughter of my people is greater than the punishment of the sin of Sodom, which was overthrown in a moment with no end to hell. He says he feels like this is worse than what happened to Sodom and Gomorrah. Verse 11, he says, the Lord has fulfilled his fury. He has poured out his fierce anger. He kindled a fire in Zion and has devoured its foundations. And so he describes what he feels is a hopeless situation. But he goes on and he says, remember, God is just. Verse 21, rejoice and be glad, O daughter of Edom, you who dwell in the land of Uz. The cup shall also pass over to you, and you shall become drunk and make yourself naked. It's talking about these countries who really, they had done more. They had taken advantage of Jerusalem when they were destroyed. They had done far more than they were supposed to. And so he says, the punishment of your iniquity is accomplished, O daughter of Zion, and he will no longer send you into captivity. He will punish your iniquity, O daughter of Eden. He will uncover your sins. God sees when we are treated wrong, and he works those things out. And then finally in chapter 5, he says, what do we do now? We wait for God's redemption. And the first part of this chapter, most of this chapter, it's the shortest one, 22 verses, but they're shorter verses. Most of this chapter is about the fact that when we deal with the consequences of these things, whether it's our fault or not, we just have to kind of accept those realities. He describes it, he says in the first 3 verses that we have been conquered. That's not going to change. Verse 4, he says, we pay for the water we drink, and our wood comes at a price. Is that we used to own the water, and now we have to buy it from somebody else. That's not going to change. Verse 8, he says, servants rule over us. It's not the kings of Judah anymore, but somebody else, and there is none to deliver us from their hands. We get our bread at the risk of our lives. It's such a different situation, and he says, that's not going to change. Verse 15, it describes the joy of our heart has ceased, and our dance has turned into mourning. The crown has fallen from our head, and woe to us, for we have sinned. Because of this our heart is faint. Because of these things our eyes grow dim. Because of Mount Zion, which is desolate, with foxes walking about on. He says this was a city full of thousands of people, and now it's a wilderness where foxes feel welcome to come. That wasn't going to change anytime soon. We have to just sometimes accept the consequences, the reality of our situation. But he ends with this thought. He says, God will redeem us. Now, a lot of times when they ask these questions, it sounds kind of like they're saying they're not sure if God is going to, but that was a typical kind of way of writing that was sort of an implied answer. They knew it confidently. He says in verse 19, you, O Lord, remain forever, your throne from generation to generation. Why do you forget us forever and forsake us for so long a time? Turn us back to you, O Lord, and we will be restored. Renew our days as of old, unless you have utterly rejected us and are very angry with us. Right? And in chapter 3, he described God's compassion. He knows that God is going to forgive them if they are humble. And that's just a way that they often ask that question, to really prompt God and say, we are ready for that now. We trust that when the time is right, you are going to redeem us. And so the beauty of the book of Lamentations is it shows that no matter how dark the days get, if you are breathing, there is always a reason to hope. If you are still alive, there is always an opportunity for God to make these things right. And so don't give in to the feeling that all things are lost. Focus on his mercy and his justice. Focus on his hope and wait on his timing. And we'll see. He really always does work that out. And if there's any way that we can be of service to you tonight, to pray for you, or the elders to counsel you through something, we'd ask that you come forward now as we stand and as we sing.